Anthony Fauci. Germ Games. Chapter 12. War Games, Genesis of the Biosecurity State. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Benjamin Franklin. Many of us are pondering when things will return to normal. The short response is never. Nothing will ever return to the broken sense of normalcy that prevailed prior to the crisis, because the coronavirus pandemic marks a fundamental inflection point in our global trajectory. Klaus Schwab, The Great Reset, July 2020. I want to be straight with you. There will be no return to the old normal for the foreseeable future. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, World Health Organization Director General. History of bioweapons. The United States began its first large-scale offensive bioweapons research during World War II in the spring of 1943 on orders from President Franklin Roosevelt as a collaboration between the U.S. military and its pharmaceutical industry partners. Pharma titan George W. Merck ran the Pentagon's first offensive bioweapons program while simultaneously directing his drug manufacturing behemoth. Merck boasted that his team could deliver biowarfare agents without vast expenditures or constructing huge facilities. Another advantage of bioweapons, he remarked, was that their development could proceed under the guise of legitimate medical research. The intelligence agencies were involved in the top-secret program from the outset. George Merck's hands-on employee, Frank Olson, was an American bacteriologist, biological warfare scientist, and CIA officer. He worked for the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories, USBWL, at Fort Detrick with Merck and the U.S. military, developing the U.S. bioweapons and psi-warfare arsenal. Project Artichoke was an experimental CIA interrogation program that used psychoactive drugs like LSD in pursuit of enhanced interrogation methods. The project was part of a larger CIA program exploring approaches for controlling both individuals and populations. That is very key, a very crucial point to recognize that the bioweapons work grew out of research involving this faction, where they were looking at the psychedelics and all of that, and what came out of that branch of study. Olson was involved with Project Artichoke with moral misgivings, beginning in May 1952. After watching a documentary on Protestant Reformation leader Martin Luther, a conscience-stricken Olson informed his bosses he intended to quit the biowarfare program. Around the time of that announcement, Olson's CIA colleague, Sidney Gottlieb, head of the CIA's MK Ultra program, that's what I was thinking about in relation to the LSD stuff, Sidney Gottlieb, covertly dosed him with LSD. Lovely. A week later, on November 28, 1953, Olson plunged to his death from a window of New York's Hotel Statler. The U.S. government first described his death as a suicide and then as a misadventure. In 1975, the government admitted its guilt in the murder and offered Olson's family an out-of-court settlement of $1,250,000, later reduced to $750,000, which they accepted with an official apology from President Gerald Ford and then CIA Director William Colby.
The government didn't come out by itself and admit this. Obviously, there was a lawsuit going on.
Well, clearly. I mean, that's how they got the money.
Yeah, that's how they were forcing the issue to surface.
Mm-hmm. By 1969, the U.S. bioweapons program had developed weapons of a nuclear equivalence, according to David Franz, who for 23 years, this is 1969, served as commander of the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, U.S. AMRID. The principal limitation Franz acknowledged was the difficulty of managing bioweapons so as to prevent accidental escape. Ironically, Franz would later play a key role in the Pentagon Fauci gain-of-function programs leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. It all ended, seemingly, in late 1969, when President Nixon traveled to Fort Detrick to announce the closure of America's bioweapons program for moral and strategic reasons. America signed the Biological Weapons Convention in 1972, forbidding development, use, and stockpiling of biological weapons, and mothballed most of its labs. But The agreement, a supplement to the Geneva Convention, left thousands of scientists, military contractors, and Pentagon caliphs as stranded assets yearning for the program's revival. The treaty also included a yawning loophole. It allowed production of anthrax and other biological warfare agents for vaccine production. The Pentagon and CIA spooks continued to cultivate bioweapons seed stock. Between 1983 and 1988, Searle Pharmaceuticals CEO Donald Rumsfeld, acting as Ronald Reagan's envoy in Iraq, arranged for the top-secret shipment of tons of chemical and biological armaments, including anthrax and bubonic plague, to Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, hoping to reverse his looming defeat by Iran's million-man army. Ayatollah Khomeini's victorious Iranian forces were then routing Saddam in their war over the Persian Gulf. The Bush administration feared the impact on global oil supplies if Iran prevailed in that conflict. The birth of the biosecurity agenda. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1988-1991, the military-industrial complex began rummaging about for a more reliable enemy to permanently justify its hefty share of the GDP. While most Americans eagerly awaited the ballyhooed peace dividend, Pentagon mandarins and their emporium of contractors may have considered with dismay that someone else would be spending money that was rightfully theirs. The peace dividend never materialized. Beginning with the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993 and culminating in 9/11, Islamic terrorism replaced the Soviets as the essential adversary in U.S. foreign policy. It may have provided solace to the military and its contractors that terrorism was a more reliable long-term foe than the Soviets. Since terrorism is a tactic, not a nation, and imprecisely defined terrorism had the allure of an enemy that could never be vanquished. We can imagine the defense contractors' relief when Vice President Dick Cheney declared the Long War, one he promised would last for generations, with battlegrounds scattered in more than 50 nations. Military contractors held tight to their gravy train with the mission of building an expensive new arsenal of anti-terror technologies. But terrorism had its own shortfall, namely, the challenge of sustaining public fear sufficient to justify spending substantial portions of GDP to meet a threat that killed fewer Americans annually than lightning strikes. By 1999, some far-sighted Pentagon planners were already looking ahead to the more exuberant and sustainable prosperity that would come with a war on germs. Most historians date the nativity of the modern biosecurity agenda to the October 2001 anthrax attacks. But years earlier, military and medical industrial complex planners were already conceptualizing biosecurity as a potent strategy for leveraging potential pandemics or bioterrorism into vast funding increases, and as a device for metamorphosing America, the world's exemplary democracy, into a national security state with global dominance. Robert Cadleck, Let the Games Begin. Bioweapons expert Robert P. Cadleck is an American physician and retired colonel in the United States Air Force who served as Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services for Preparedness and Response from August 2017 until July 2021, and who managed the COVID-19 crisis during the Trump administration. Second only to his longtime crony and comrade in arms Anthony Fauci, Robert Cadleck played an historic leadership role in fomenting the contagious logic that infectious disease posed a national security threat requiring a militarized response. Since the 1993 World Trade Center attack, Cadleck had been evangelizing about an imminent anthrax attack that would doom the American way of life. In the mid-1990s, Cadleck served as part of an elite Air Force operations unit of UN weapons inspectors fruitlessly hunting the Iraqi desert for Saddam Hussein's suspected stores of anthrax and botulism following the First Persian Gulf War. At 2:47 in the early morning of February 1st, 2020, 4 hours after his loyal grantee, virologist Christian Anderson, informed Dr. Fauci that he and other leading biologists believed that the genetic sequence responsible for the furin cleave on the virus's spike protein the peculiar structure that allows the organism to bind tightly to and infect cells with the ACE2 receptor, was highly unlikely to be the product of natural selection. Dr. Anthony Fauci filed a carefully worded email to Cadillac. Carefully worded email to Cadillac. Dr. Fauci's other emails from that evening suggest that he was intensely worried that the Chinese experiments that may have created this situation in the novel coronavirus would bear his fingerprints. If Dr. Fauci's gain-of-function research had indeed minted COVID-19, then Cadillac would also be implicated. Cadillac served on the small so-called P3 Co committee charged with approving NIH's gain-of-function experiments, and it is clear from Dr. Fauci's email that the subject was also on Cadillac's mind. Dr. Fauci attached an article to his email to Cadillac. It was Bat Lady Shi Zhengli's deceitful effort to downplay the laboratory leak hypothesis. Bob, this just came out today, Dr. Fauci told his gain-of-function confederate, gives a balanced view. Subsequent events proved that the author of that article was deliberately lying to conceal the Wuhan lab's manipulation of coronavirus pathogens that were nearly identical to the microbe that caused the COVID-19. Both Cadillac and Fauci had been involved for over a decade in promoting and funding these experiments. Through NIAID and the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA, the biosecurity funding agency that Cadillac had helped create, including funneling millions of dollars into U.S. funding to Xi, the hapless writer of the exculpatory article. Dr. Fauci's email shows these two technocrats and others patching together evidence for the dubious official story that they would tell the world. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Fauci would pull the reliable old levers that he had manipulated for decades to transform convenient canards into official orthodoxies. The contrived cosmologies he thereby constructed would hold for a full year before they finally began to unravel. That's all they were trying to do, is bide time. They knew that they were caught. Cadillac is a Dr. Strangelove knockoff with deep ties to spy agencies, Big Pharma, the Pentagon, and military contractors who profiteer from the spread of bioweapons alarmism. Intelligence agency historian and journalist Whitney Webb describes Cadillac as a man enmeshed in the world of intelligence, military intelligence, and corporate corruption, dutifully fulfilling the vision of his friends in high places and behind closed doors. In 1998, Cadillac created an internal strategy paper for the Pentagon, promoting the development of pandemic pathogens as a stealth weapon that the Pentagon could deploy against its enemies without leaving fingerprints. Biological weapons under the cover of an endemic or natural disease occurrence provides an attacker the potential for plausible denial. Biological warfare's potential to create significant economic losses and consequential political instability, coupled with plausible deniability, exceeds the possibilities of any other human weapon. Cadillac, in 1999, organized his paranoia into several illustrative scenarios to demonstrate the United States' vulnerability to biological attack. In one of Cadillac's doomsday fantasies, dubbed corn terrorism, China clandestinely sprays corn seed blight over the Midwest from commercial airliners. Cadillac warns, China gained significant corn market share and tens of billions of dollars of additional profits from their crop, while leaving the U.S. Corn Belt in ruin. Another Cadillac scenario, titled Lousy Wine, envisions disgruntled European winemakers covertly releasing grape lice concealed in cans of pâté to target California wine producers. In an April 2001 study for the National Defense University National War College, Cadillac urgently recommended the creation of a strategic national stockpile to warehouse countermeasures, including vaccines and antibiotics, and recommended regulatory changes to provide for mandatory vaccinations and coercive quarantines in the event of a pandemic. Those ideas helped win him an appointment as Special Assistant for Biodefense Planning to President George W. Bush after post-September 11th anthrax attacks later that same year. From this sinecure, Cadillac's fervent lobbying persuaded Congress to establish a strategic national stockpile whose contents are currently worth $7 billion. Cadillac would come to control purchases for that stockpile, and following the lead of his comrades, Bill Gates and Tony Fauci, he would use that power to enrich his vaccine industry friends and sideline public health. As journalist Alexis Baden-Meyer observed, Cadillac created the biodefense industrial complex as we know it, and he rules it like a czar. Bill Gates, Anthony Fauci funded biosecurity. Let the war games begin. In 1999, Dr. Cadillac organized a simulation of a smallpox terrorist attack on U.S. soil for joint exercise by the newly formed Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Strategies and the Department of Health and Human Services. The founder of the center was D.A. Henderson, famed for leading the program that eradicated smallpox in 1977. The senior fellow and co-founder of the Johns Hopkins Center was a CIA spook and pharmaceutical industry lobbyist named Tara O'Toole. She took over as chief when Henderson left. The third center director was Tom Inglesby, who remained in that role. In 1999, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation committed $20 million to Johns Hopkins to establish the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health. Oh my God. For the next 2 decades, Gates would direct a vast stream of funding to the enterprise of elevating biosecurity as the national priority. Some of his most visible investments funded a series of simulations presided over by Inglesby at his Johns Hopkins Center. Those simulations would make Inglesby the congenial face of biosecurity paranoia, feed the burgeoning biodefense industry, and help lay the foundation for the modern security state. The deal pipeline from NIH to NIAID to Johns Hopkins, an astonishing $13 billion since 2001, dwarfs Gates' contributions to the school. But shoddy or perhaps deliberately obscure reporting makes it nearly impossible to determine how many of those dollars flowed to Inglesby and his center. Cadillac's simulations, and over a dozen that would succeed it over the next 20-plus years, many under Bill Gates' direction, shared common features. None of them emphasized protecting public health by showing Americans how to bolster their immune systems, to eat well, to lose weight, to exercise, to maintain vitamin D levels, to avoid chemical exposure. None of these focused on devising the vital communications infrastructures to link frontline doctors during a pandemic or to facilitate the development and refinement of optical treatment protocols. None of these dealt seriously with the need to identify off-the-shelf, now known as repurposed therapeutic drugs to mitigate fatalities and to shorten a pandemic's duration. None of them considered ways to isolate the sick and protect the vulnerable, or how to shield people in nursing homes and other institutions from infection. None of them questioned the efficacy of masks, lockdowns, and social distancing in reducing casualties. None of them engaged in soul-searching about how to preserve constitutional rights during a global pandemic. Instead, the simulations wargamed how to use police powers to detain and quarantine citizens, how to impose martial law, how to control messaging by deploying propaganda, how to employ censorship to silence dissent, and how to mandate masks, lockdowns, and coercive vaccinations and conduct track and trace surveillance among potentially reluctant populations. Coercion should be the last strategy to consider in a pandemic, remarked physician and biological warfare expert Merrill Nass, MD. If you have a remedy that works, people will flock to get it. It's troubling that the first and only option was creating a police state. The still unsolved mystery of the post-9/11 anthrax attacks. Contemporaneously with Johns Hopkins' smallpox simulation, the Pentagon launched a top-secret project at a former nuclear weapons site in the Nevada desert, to test the feasibility of building a small anthrax production facility using off-the-shelf equipment easily available in hardware stores and biological supply catalogs. Codenamed Project Bacchus, a small cohort of faux terrorist military weapons experts succeeded in producing a few pounds of anthrax. 2 years after the Pentagon's Nevada anthrax project, someone associated with the United States Army mounted a far-reaching campaign of sending anthrax to members of Congress and key media figures, officially launching the biosecurity era. In light of subsequent events, we cannot exclude the possibility that someone in our government carried out a false flag attack against Americans as a provocation for some larger agenda. This is not an outlandish conspiracy theory. During my uncle's presidential administration, the Joint Chiefs of Staff submitted a plan termed Operation Northwoods, proposing false flag attacks, including mass murders of random American citizens, to justify an invasion of Cuba. My uncle rejected with horror to Joint Chief Chairman Lyman Limnensur's Northwoods briefing pitch and abruptly walked out of the presentation. And they call us the human race, he remarked to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. U.S. intelligence agencies and military-industrial complex insiders initially, and ultimately wrongly, blamed the 2001 anthrax litter attacks on Saddam Hussein or al-Qaeda, later used similarly incorrect pretexts to launch a war against Iraq. The mailing of anthrax introduced Americans to a new enemy of more frightening than garden-variety terrorism. While terrorists could destroy key buildings and airliners, the biosecurity narrative warns that pathogens could enter any American home invisibly and slay its occupants. Germs, therefore, easily outgunned al-Qaeda as a reliable wellspring of terror. This was the lesson Cadillac had been broadcasting for 5 years. The delivery of anthrax through the mail brought home his jeremiads. In 2020, biosecurity would altogether eclipse Islamic terrorism as the spear tip of U.S. military and foreign policy. The topic of infectious diseases suddenly became the most effective way to open government pockets. Meet the al-Hibri family. In 1998, Lebanese-born financier Ibrahim el-Hibri and his son Faoud, with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral William Crowe, Jr., established a corporation called Bioport and paid the state of Michigan $25 million for its aging vaccine manufacturing campus. The purpose the el-Hibris intended to use the factory for was to manufacture anthrax vaccine for sale to the U.S. military. El-Hibri Sr. was a longtime associate of both Robert Cadillac and Admiral Crowe, who chaired the Joint Chiefs under Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush. The el-Hibris had previous success in the anthrax vaccine business, having made a small fortune by purchasing anthrax vaccines made by the UK government and reselling them at 100 times the purchase price to the Saudi Arabian government. Less than a month after taking over the Michigan-based business, Bioport signed an exclusive $29 million contract with the Pentagon to manufacture, test, bottle, and store the anthrax vaccine for American troops stationed abroad. The Secretary of the Army indemnified the factory the day before signing the contract on September 3rd of 1998. The el-Hibris never safety tested their concoction. They didn't have to. They had no liability for injuries. 10 months before the el-Hibris bought the plant, an FDA audit uncovered contamination problems, suspect record-keeping, and assorted security breaches at their laboratory, as well as 9 million stored doses of adulterated vaccine. Almost as soon as Bioport was formed, it began receiving large sums from the U.S. Army to rehabilitate the anthrax plant, but it was still unable to pass an FDA audit. In 1999, they bulldozed the factory and rebuilt it at taxpayer expense. The state of Michigan sweetened the deal, but the FDA would not give its stamp of approval to the new manufacturing facility. Bioport, with a hefty lobbying team and designer furniture in its executive offices, kept crying poor and coming back to the U.S. government for additional handouts before finally falling into a death spiral around the bankruptcy drain in mid-2001. In October of 2001, anthrax incidents proved the el-Hibris' salvation. The Pentagon leveraged the strange attacks, turning them into the long-awaited provocation, justifying the crusade to expand the battlefront in bioweapons research. In 1972, the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention meant neither the brass nor the spooks could legally research or produce bioweapons. But the convention left open the loophole that signatories could develop dual-use vaccine and weapon technologies so long as the projects had a defensive rationale. After the anthrax attacks, vaccine suddenly became a euphemism for bioweapons and a ticket back to deep water for a beached biowarfare industry. Military planners at the Pentagon, BARDA, DARPA, and the CIA, through U.S. aid, began pouring money into gain-of-function experiments. Dual-use research was suddenly in vogue. Dark winter of 2001. During June 22nd and 23rd of 2001, less than 3 months before the 9/11 attacks, the Pentagon launched a war game codenamed Operation Dark Winter at Andrews Air Force Base that emphasized the military's earnest commitment to bioweapon vaccines. Robert Cadleck, the lead organizer of this pandemic simulation, also coined its code name. The tabletop scenario simulated a smallpox attack on U.S. locations, beginning in Oklahoma City, the site of a real domestic terror attack in 1995. Dark Winter participants explored strategies for imposing coercive quarantines, censorship, mandatory masking, lockdowns, and vaccination, and expanded police powers as the only rational response to the pandemic. The failure in the Dark Winter case to quickly implement such countermeasures allowed the galloping spread of the Pentagon's imaginary smallpox epidemic to overwhelm America's response capabilities, precipitating mass civilian casualties, widespread panic, societal breakdowns, and mob violence. The Pentagon summary of the exercise concluded that scarcity of vaccines to curtail the contagion spread proved the most severe limitation on management options. The Dark Winter exercise eerily predicted many aspects of what would follow just months later with the anthrax letter attacks. Such uncanny miracles of foreshadowing became a recurring feature of each subsequent germ game. The spooks and the simulations. By playing the role of U.S. President, the Senate Defense Committee's longtime chairman, Senator Sam Nunn, a dyed-in-the-wool warhawk, brought prestige, urgency, and a militaristic gestalt to Cadleck's Dark Winter exercise. Most of the other key participants shared Cadleck's intelligence agency pedigrees. CIA involvement was a consistent feature of this in all subsequent simulations. Other participants included Robert Cadleck's fellow intelligence officer and War College professor, Colonel Randall Larson, USAF, another career bioweapons expert who helped choreograph the exercise and appeared in its fictional scripted news clips, CIA's former director, James Woolsey, a participant and organizer, as was a pharmaceutical industry lobbyist and biological weapons expert, Tara O'Toole, a director of the CIA hedge fund In-Q-Tel, the CIA's former deputy director for science and technology, Ruth David, Hopkins bioterrorism expert Tom Inglesby, and New York Times journalist Judith Miller also participated. James Woolsey's presence and that of Colonel Larson, Ruth David, and Tara O'Toole signaled the intelligence community's ubiquitous but shadowy presence in biosecurity and all things vaccine. I sat on a board with Woolsey for several years and am familiar with his deep anxieties about germ warfare. Woolsey's germ phobia rivals Cadleck's. Woolsey calls a biological weapons attack the single most dangerous threat to U.S. national security in the foreseeable future. O'Toole is a biodefense enthusiast, co-founder of the Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Studies, and executive vice president at the CIA's investment arm, In-Q-Tel. That shady firm is the vector by which U.S. intelligence services infiltrate startup firms on the cutting edge of technological innovation. O'Toole, like her long-term Confederate Cadleck, juggles deep and disturbing relationships with the same retinue of rapacious pharmaceutical industry and military contractors that Cadleck also cultivated. In 2009, when President Obama nominated O'Toole for Undersecretary for Science and Technology at the Department of Homeland Security, Senator John McCain criticized her for concealing her role as strategic director of a pharmaceutical industry lobbying outfit, Alliance Biosciences. Alliances is an unincorporated corporate front group created by Ibrahim El-Hebri and his partner, former Joint Chiefs Chair Admiral William Crowe, and funded by other bioweapons firms. Alliance has no tax filing and operates out of a K Street influence shop. The congressional record shows that Alliance is a so-called stealth lobbying firm that spent $500,000 over 2005 and 2009 pitching Congress and the Homeland Security Department for greater biodefense expenditures, particularly for anthrax vaccines. Alliance's other funders include Pfizer, the International Pharmaceutical Aerosol Consortium, and SIG Technologies, a biodefense military contractor. O'Toole's nomination to Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security also prompted objections from more mainstream bioweapons experts, including the preeminent Rutgers microbiologist Richard Ebright. She was the single most extreme person, either in or out of government, advocating for a massive biodefense expansion in relation to provisions of safety and security. Albright added, "She makes Dr. Strangelove look sane." O'Toole supported every flawed decision and counterproductive policy on biodefense, biosafety, and biosecurity during the Bush administration. O'Toole is as out of touch with reality and a paranoiac. It would be hard to think of a person less well-suited to that position. During those same 2009 confirmation hearings, Democratic Senator Carl Levin of Michigan added to the voices of skepticism. Dr. O'Toole fell short of the strict adherence to scientific principles when she was director at the Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Strategies. Noting that Dr. O'Toole was one of the principal designers and authors of the 2001 Dark Winter exercise that simulated a covert attack on the United States by bioterrorists, Levin faulted O'Toole for using the exercise to promote her biosecurity agenda with hyperbolic pandemic fantasies. But many top scientists have said that the Dark Winter exercise was based on faulty and exaggerated assumptions about the transmission rate of smallpox. Dr. James Koopman of the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Michigan made the ungenerous assessment of O'Toole's enthusiasm for germ warfare had clouded her scientific judgment. Koopman, an expert in modeling the transmission rates of infectious diseases who participated in the smallpox eradication program, complained that Dr. O'Toole has not sought balanced scientific input in her thinking, that she shows a lack of analytic orientation to scientific issues, and that she has generated hype about bioterrorism that she will feel obligated to defend rather than pursue a balanced approach. Dr. Michael Lane, the former director for the Centers of Disease Control Smallpox Eradication Program, likewise condemned O'Toole for padding her assumptions about smallpox transmission rates in Dark Winter, which he characterized as improbable and even absurd. Ironically, even Dr. Fauci, who by then was already the king of embellishing and fabricating pandemics, voiced his disapproval of O'Toole and Cadillac's extreme Dark Winter exaggerations, which Dr. Fauci declared much, much worse than would have been the case in real life. The transmission rate of smallpox was not the only area where Dr. O'Toole and Cadillac ignored facts. On February 19th of 2002, O'Toole wrote that many experts believe that the smallpox virus is not confined to these two official repositories, one in the United States and one in Russia, and may be in the possession of states or subnational groups pursuing active biological weapons programs. O'Toole cited a June 13, 1999 New York Times article as the source for her alarming assertion that subnational groups controlled smallpox stocks. But that article included no reference to any non-state group actors possessing any biological weapons. Another key Dark Winter planner and participant was Ruth David, a former deputy director at the CIA. In 1998, David became president of Answer, a non-profit corporation with deep ties to the CIA. Answer plays a key role pushing the government toward Homeland Security post 9/11 and became a primary promoter of biometric and facial recognition software for U.S. law enforcement agencies. Among other functions, Answer funds a mysterious defense contractor from South Carolina called Advanced Technology International. ATI somehow became the vector through which the government arranged at least $6 billion of secretive Operation Warp Speed vaccine contracts with Pfizer, Bill Gates' Novavax vaccine, Johnson & Johnson, and Sanofi. These contracts, comprising the majority of Operation Warp Speed's $10 billion budget, suggest a deep CIA involvement with the COVID-19 vaccine enterprise's cozy deals with Big Pharma. As Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response with HHS, Robert Cadillac personally signed off on those sweetheart deals. The terms allowed Operation speed to completely bypass the regulatory oversight and transparency of traditional federal contracting mechanisms, as NPR put it. In a January 2021 expose, the New York Times dug into Cadillac's secretive vaccine contracts, observing that available documents suggest that drug companies demanded and received flexible delivery schedules as well as patent protections and immunity from liability if anything goes wrong. In some instances, countries are prohibited from donating or reselling doses, a ban that could hamper efforts to get vaccines to poor countries. Dark Winter Aftermath. Despite all its hiccups, Dark Winter was an extraordinary success and foreshadowed the real bioweapons incidents occurring less than 3 months later, inflamed public germophobia, and fortified the official narrative after the first September 18th anthrax letters, which pointed fingers at Saddam Hussein and or al-Qaeda as the probable culprits. Several Dark Winter participants displayed extraordinary prescience in the weeks leading up to the anthrax attacks, along with a relentless determination to pin the caper on Saddam. The anthrax attack's first casualty, Robert Stevens, was hospitalized and diagnosed with anthrax on October 2nd. Highly publicized and laudatory Senate hearings on the Dark Winter simulation that began on October 1st, 3 days before the anthrax attacks became public knowledge, functioned to imbue U.S. government officials, the national press, and the public with Dark Winter's paranoid assumptions, and to assign the blame to Saddam. Another Dark Winter planner, Jerome Hauer, along with spymaster James Woolsey and New York Times reporter Judith Miller, spent the 3 weeks between 9/11 and 10/4 banging the gong about imminent anthrax attacks, carpet bombing the television talk shows, kibitzing on the nightly news, and gabbing up the Sunday morning TV gas bags. Judith Miller received special assistance in this task from her employer, the New York Times, which published her numerous alarmist reports and warnings about coming biological attacks on American soil. Incredibly, the attack arrived exactly as Miller, Hauer, and Woolsey predicted, and with exquisite timing, smack in the middle of the U.S. Senate hearings over America's vulnerability to an anthrax attack. Hauer, a bioterrorism expert and pharmaceutical industry operative, is currently an executive with Teneo, a consulting firm that counsels corporations on security matters, and is one of the leading advocates of mandatory vaccines for employees as a condition of employment. Members of the think tank, the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, also played a key role in sounding the alarm that a biological weapons attack was certain to follow on the heels of 9/11, and then simultaneously amplified the panic and blamed Iraq following the anthrax letter attacks. PNAC's core doctrine was that, as the Cold War victor, America and U.S.-based multinationals, particularly petroleum and pharmaceutical companies, had earned the right to rule the world for a century or so. PNAC members populated virtually all of the key foreign policy posts in the Bush White House. The warmongering cabal called themselves the Vulcans in honor of their belligerent brand of U.S. imperialism. Their members included Dick Cheney, Scooter Libby, Donald Rumsfeld, Douglas Feith, Elliot Abrams, Don Bolton, and Rumsfeld's advisors Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz. Critics called them the Chicken Hawks because, ironically, each one of them had draft dodged the Vietnam War. Osama bin Laden, the author of the World Trade Center attack, supposedly directed that operation from an Afghan cave, but Donald Rumsfeld complained. There aren't any good targets in Afghanistan. The PNAC Chicken Hawks were determined to use 9/11 as a pretext for a war against Iraq, beneath which God had mischievously stockpiled so much of America's oil. Anthrax provided that provocation. Control of global oil resources was, for PNAC, a key stepping stone for the coming century of American imperialism, and a bioweapon attack against America became the ideal provocation for preemptive invasion. It's noteworthy that Judith Miller not only covered the Dark Winter exercise for the New York Times, she was also an active planner and participant in the simulation, playing the part of a reporter. Miller was an OG germaphobe and veteran biosecurity booster. On September 4th, 2001, exactly 1 week before the 9/11 attacks, Miller, excerpting from a paranoid book, Germs, she had written with Times reporter William Broad and Steve Engelberg, reported approvingly in the New York Times that the Pentagon had green-lighted a project to make a potentially more potent form of anthrax bacteria. Miller did not explain why this response seemed rational or even sane. Miller's articles repeating Pentagon and CIA claims about Saddam's bioweapons cache and his probable involvement with the anthrax attacks helped fuel the U.S. invasion of Iraq, according to the New York Magazine. During the winter of 2001 and throughout 2002, Miller produced a series of stunning stories about Saddam Hussein's ambitions and capacity to produce weapons of mass destruction, almost all of which have turned out to be stunningly inaccurate. Miller's jingoistic reporting, New York Magazine dubbed her Chicken Little, played such a decisive role in violating the White House warmonger's Iraq invasion agenda that the New York Times afterwards made an unprecedented apology for its role in what was then, arguably, the worst foreign policy decision in the United States history. Miller was so keen to facilitate an Iraq invasion that she illegally leaked the identity of CIA agent Valerie Plame to punish Plame's husband, State Department diplomat Joseph Wilson, who had publicly challenged White House and CIA narratives about Iraq obtaining yellowcake uranium from Niger. The CIA at that time was aggressively pushing for war. George W. Bush said later that his worst mistake during his White House years was swallowing the CIA's guarantees. The biggest regret of all the presidency has to have been the intelligence failure in Iraq. A lot of people put their reputations on the line and said weapons of mass destruction is a reason to remove Saddam Hussein. In 2003, during the run-up to the war, CIA Director George Tenet assured President Bush that Saddam had a secret arsenal of weapons of mass destruction. Don't worry, it's a slam dunk. Miller served 3 months in jail for contempt before she agreed to disclose the identity of her Confederate, Louis Scooty Libby, VP Cheney's chief of staff. Libby, who told Miller that Plame was a clandestine CIA agent and directed her to publish the revelation, subsequently went to prison for the crime. It will be many years before the CIA releases documents explaining the agency's true relationships, if any, with Miller and Libby. Libby, a PNAC founder and key visionary and promoter of America's 100-year Reich, was an early champion of the modern biosecurity agenda with multiple personnel connections to the intelligence community at Yale, Rand, Northrop Grumman, and the Pentagon. The State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, his employer in the early 1980s, had and still has deep CIA ties. His obsession with bioterrorism led Libby to write a novel about a smallpox pandemic and earned him the White House nickname Germ Boy. Following his pardon and subsequent prison release by President Donald Trump, Libby joined Robert Cadillac's Blue Ribbon Panel for Biodefense, BRPB, which promotes biosecurity as the fulcrum of U.S. foreign policy. The 21st century is the age of U.S. empire and mass vaccination as a foreign policy tool. Libby's fellow BRPB director, William Koresh, is the executive vice president of Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance, the organization through which Dr. Fauci, Cadillac, and the Pentagon, through DARPA, were laundering gain-of-function payments to Chinese scientists in Wuhan. Libby also serves as senior vice president of the Hudson Institute, a think tank with deep connections to the pharmaceutical industry, Monsanto, and the CIA. He guides the Institute's program on national security and defense issues. In 2021, former CIA Director Mike Pompeo joined the Hudson Institute. The pervasive CIA involvement in the global vaccine putsch should give us pause. There is nothing in the CIA's history, in its charter, in its composition, or in its institutional culture that betrays an interest in promoting either public health or democracy. The CIA's historical preoccupations have been power and control. The CIA has been involved in at least 72 attempted and successful coups d'etats between 1947 and 1989, involving about a third of the world's governments. Many of these were functioning democracies at the time. The CIA does not do public health. It does not do democracy. The CIA does coups d'etats. Smallpox, biosecurity blossoms. Dark winter was part of a persistent campaign by the intelligence agencies and the bioweapons lobby to keep smallpox fears alive in the public consciousness. Even before the disease was eradicated in 1977, public health regulators had discontinued smallpox vaccinations in the United States. Public health advocates urged the federal bureaucracies and the military to destroy their smallpox stockpile to prevent the disease from escaping and possibly decimating humanity. Ignoring these warnings, the George W. Bush administration purchased even more. During the run-up to the Iraq War, President Bush aimed to inoculate the U.S. population with smallpox vaccines. Skeptics charged that the reckless scheme was PNAC's transparent gimmick for hyping fear of Saddam Hussein's mythological bioweapons program. Dr. Merrill Nass, writing on the history of smallpox vaccine, later reported, "The smallpox vaccine was well known to be highly reactogenic. When the vaccine was given to healthcare workers and first responders in 2003, episodes of heart failure, heart attacks, myocarditis, and death quickly mounted. Doctors and nurses learned that they could not sue for damages if injured, and at first there was no federal compensation either. They began refusing to be vaccinated." The Clinton administration continued to stockpile millions of smallpox vaccines, and Congress allotted money for a compensation program, but the maximum award was only $250,000 for a permanent disability or death. After distributing 40 million inoculations, the wave of alarming injuries caused the government to abandon the project's civilian arm. The military continued vaccinating soldiers with the untested, unapproved, deadly vaccine with catastrophic results. The vaccine caused symptomatic myocarditis in one of every 216 soldiers and subclinical myocarditis in one of 35. According to a 2015 U.S. Army study, government officials have since recognized vaccines as a probable culprit in the era's epidemic of Gulf War syndrome, which affected vaccinated soldiers, both deployed and those vaccinated in preparation for deployment but never deployed. The court observed that, absent an informed consent of presidential waiver, the United States cannot demand that members of the armed forces also serve as guinea pigs for experimental drugs. The October 4th anthrax attack. Less than 4 months after the Dark Winter simulation and 3 weeks after 9/11, a mysterious spate of letters containing fine white anthrax spores arrived by mail at several news media outlets and the Capitol Hill offices of 2 senators, Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. Those 2 senators had been the most vocal in condemning the post-9/11 infringements on civil liberties pushed by the PNAC crowd. Administration and press accusations pegging Saddam Hussein as the probable culprit in the anthrax attacks, which killed 5 Americans, fueled Congress's hasty passage of the Patriot Act. As Michael Moore proved, not a single elected member had read the bill and its jingoistic declaration of war on Iraq. By abolishing traditional privacy protection, the Patriot Act created an entire terror industry, according to a 2021 report by Action Center on Race and Economy. The biggest beneficiaries have been Silicon Valley tech companies, particularly Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, who have partnered with federal intelligence agencies to mine data and profit from the war on terror by at least $44 billion since 2001. The Patriot Act passage, the report says, opened the door for big tech to become first and foremost the brokers of our personal data, selling it to secret agencies and private companies at home and abroad, unleashing the era of the digital economy. Second only to Vice President Dick Cheney, the staunchest war hawk among George W. Bush's Beltway coterie, was his Secretary of Defense, former Searle Pharmaceutical CEO and PNAC chieftain Donald Rumsfeld, the very man who 14 years earlier had given Saddam his anthrax arsenal. While no one has ever proven the origin of the anthrax in those letters, the FBI concluded that the powder had come from a U.S. military lab. Robert Cadlick was first among the large coterie of pharmaceutical companies and military contractors to benefit from the anthrax scare. Immediately after the anthrax letters arrived, Cadlick became a special advisor on biological warfare to then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and his PNAC deputy Paul Wolfowitz. 3 suspects, all linked to the U.S. military. The PNAC cabal was determined to blame the anthrax attack on Saddam Hussein, and Rumsfeld's deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, tasked Cadlick with confirming the presence of bentonite and the anthrax used in the attacks. Experts had advised Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz that bentonite was a fingerprint unique to the Iraqi anthrax stocks. Its presence would therefore put the blame on Saddam. Cadlick did not succeed in finding bentonite in any of the anthrax samples that the FBI tested. But repeated media reports claiming otherwise allowed warmongers to drum up jingoistic hysteria against Saddam. By late October of 2001, one nationwide poll found that 74% of respondents wanted the United States to take military action against Baghdad, despite a complete lack of evidence connecting Iraq to either 9/11 or the anthrax attacks. Instead of pointing the finger at Saddam, the FBI lab found that the anthrax spores originated from one of the three U.S. Army labs, Fort Detrick, a lab at the University of Scranton, or Battelle's West Jefferson facility, owned by an El Hebrew business partner. The FBI closed its investigation after its leading suspect, a vaccinologist, Dr. Bruce Ivans, who ran the U.S. Army lab at Fort Detrick, allegedly took his own life. A multitude of critics of the shoddy and haphazard FBI investigation complained that Ivans was the victim of a ham-handed FBI frame. According to the FBI's former lead investigator, Richard Lambert, the FBI team hit a mountain of evidence that would have exonerated Ivans. In 2008, following Ivans' untimely suicide, Department of Justice civil attorneys in Florida defending a claim by the widow of anthrax victim Robert Stevens publicly challenged the FBI's assertions that Ivans had been the culprit and instead pointedly suggested that a private laboratory in Ohio managed by Battelle and linked to the El Hebrews could have been involved in the attacks. DOJ headquarters quickly had its Florida attorneys rewrite their brief omitting this claim. An Italian publication, Il Manifesto, reported in its October 2001 issue that the FBI had placed the El Hebrews on its suspect list for sending the anthrax spores through the U.S. mail. Cui bono? Since 1995, Cadillac had been frothing about bioterrorism to war college students and urging the creation of a strategic national stockpile to warehouse vaccines and other countermeasures. In 2004, with Cadillac now working for Secretary Rumsfeld at the Bush White House, Congress passed the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness Act, which Cadillac drafted, directing the Secretary of HHS to maintain a strategic national stockpile managed jointly by DHS and HHS. The same week, Congress passed the Project BioShield Act, which Cadillac also helped draft, launching the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, a government-operated investment bank that would germinate new technologies for Cadillac's stockpile. With Cadillac's guidance, BARDA would become a federal ATM machine for big pharma, biofence contractors, and gain-of-function researchers. Along with Dr. Fauci's NIAID and Pentagon's DARPA, BARDA would be the other big league funder for experiments to create pandemic superbugs in Wuhan and elsewhere. Cadillac's statute authorized the purchase of $5 billion of material, including vaccines, for the stockpile, creating a gold mine, as we shall see, for Cadillac's friends, the El Hebrews. Another conspicuous beneficiary of the stockpile was then Secretary of State Donald Rumsfeld and Cadillac's bosses, who made a killing during the 2004 fake bird flu pandemic, which Tony Fauci ginned up with his confederate and ambitious young British physician and Wellcome Trust researcher Jeremy Farrar. 16 years later, as director of Wellcome Trust, Farrar would play a key role in the 2020 Wuhan cover-up. The Pentagon in 2004 and 2005, in response to Farrar's concocted contagion, stockpiled 80 million doses of Gilead's flu remedy, Tamiflu. Secretary Rumsfeld had served on the board of Gilead from 1988 to 2001 and was its chairman from 1997 until he joined the Bush administration as defense secretary. He retained stock in the pharmaceutical company, which netted him a $5 million profit from the Tamiflu run-up. George Shultz, another PNAC warhawk, also hit the jackpot, cashing in $7 million of Gilead stock during the Tamiflu run-up. The biggest winners, however, were the El Hebrews. The anthrax attacks brought them exoneration, salvation, and extravagant windfalls. Bioport's rebirth and reinvention as emergent biosolutions. Anthrax arrived just in time for the El Hebrews. Bioport was by then on the ropes. The El Hebrews anthrax vaccine facility was facing bankruptcy and the loss of its operating license. Bioport's Pentagon contract expired in August of 2001, with a host of outstanding accounting mysteries impeding its renewal. The Pentagon had given Bioport millions to renovate its factory, but much of that money instead financed senior management bonuses and an opulent makeover for the El Hebrews executive offices. Millions more simply disappeared, according to journalist Whitney Webb. In 2000, not long after receiving its first Pentagon bailout, Bioport contracted none other than Battelle Memorial Institute to cultivate its anthrax seed stock. Cadlec's boss, Donald Rumsfeld, told aides that his biosecurity priority after the incidence of anthrax sent through the mail was rescuing Bioport. We're going to try to save it and try to fashion some sort of an arrangement whereby we give one more crack at getting the job done with that outfit. It's the only outfit in this country that is anything underway, and it's not very well underway, as you point out. Gold Rush. In the summer of 2001, 2 months before 9/11 the 9/11 World Trade Center attacks, the Department of Defense officially launched its drive to revive bioweapons research by sending a report to Congress authored by Cadlec pleading that the military system for developing vaccines to protect troops from anthrax, smallpox, and other exotic bioweapons is insufficient and will fail. Beginning with the 9/11 attack, the war on terror triggered a tectonic shift in global security priorities and elephantine ripples in defense spending patterns across the globe as open democracies began shifting to a security state footing. The revival of U.S. government interest in germ warfare opened new opportunities. The U.S. biodefense budget went from $137 million in 1997 to $14.5 billion for 2001 and 2004. Every agency with a colorable claim to a national security function paddled out frantically to barrel the money tsunami. Between 2001 and 2014, the United States spent around $80 billion on biodefense. Since germ weaponry was still illegal, vaccines became a critical euphemism for the revival of the multi-billion-dollar bioweapons industry. Pentagon sources told Science magazine that the military was applying for a sweeping overhaul of how the federal government develops vaccines to protect both the military and civilians. The Pentagon's assault on the vaccine space was both an opportunity and threat to Dr. Fauci and NIAID. U.S. Vice President Cheney and his PNAC Confederates found some convenient loopholes in the Geneva Convention through which they drove a 40-fold expansion in spending in biological weapons research. The Department of Defense had strict systems in place to ensure compliance with the Biological Weapons Convention. Those restrictions limited the Pentagon's freedom to undertake new research programs, particularly those referred to as the leading edge of biodefense. Cheney's response, recalls Professor Richard Ebright, was to transfer this research from the Department of Defense to the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID. By about 2004, this transfer was complete, and NIAID had been transformed into an arm of the defense sector. This made the NIAID director, Anthony Fauci, a major player in biodefense and germ warfare. Dr. Fauci sharpened his elbows and began maneuvering for a leading role for NIAID in milking the BARDA Homeland Security's cash cows. NIAID's biosecurity budget went from $0 in 2000 to $1.7 billion after the 2001 anthrax letters, much of that for bioweapons vaccines. Within 5 months following the anthrax postal incidents, Dr. Fauci had created 2 new sub-agencies to capture his share of the cheese: the NIAID Strategic Plan for Biodefense Research and the NIAID Biodefense Research Agenda for CDC Category A agents, which were those microorganisms designated by CDC to be potential pandemic pathogens. To populate the sub-agencies, he assembled a cadre of his loyal deputies and infectious disease principal investigators from the HIV bonanza. Their mission was to brand contagions as pressing terror threats, drum up pandemic panic, and lobby for government support for NIAID's new battery of biodefense vaccinations. Dr. Fauci and the El Hebrews found common cause. Dr. Fauci could run interference for the El Hebrews at FDA, overriding regulatory anxieties about Bioport's laboratory and product safety. The El Hebrews, in turn, provided Dr. Fauci with ready-made biodefense vaccine and a beachhead into the arcane maze of military contracting. Taking to the airwaves, Dr. Fauci made himself the face of biodefense. In a style now familiar to Americans, Fauci warned the public that postal workers who had handled the letters containing anthrax spores might still be harboring those in their lungs, even after taking 2 months of antibiotics, spreading plague with the morning mail. Taking the L. Hebrews vaccine prophylactically, Dr. Fauci advised, might help. Dr. Fauci's signature fear-mongering was, of course, his trademark, science-free speculation. Nestling the L. Hebrews under his protective wing, Dr. Fauci swept aside the FDA's safety concerns and publicly praised Bioport's experimental anthrax vaccine, Biothrax. He brushed aside the reservations of critics that the L. Hebrews never established Biothrax's safety with some of his prototypical dissembling. Dr. Fauci said, the vaccine is designed to get the immune system to recognize the proteins and therefore the bacteria and destroy both. In a December 2001 PBS interview, Fauci promised to deliver Biothrax, which had failed to pass a single FDA audit during the prior 4 years, at a record pace. Fauci explained, in usual times, that is a process that takes years and years, but he committed that his project for delivering Biothrax is going to be markedly truncated because of the urgency of the situation. PBS observed that because of Bioport's production problems, the Pentagon had dramatically sealed back its plan to vaccinate U.S. forces, and there were insufficient anthrax vaccines in the Pentagon's stockpile to conduct the massed civilian inoculation program that had been Dr. Fauci's ultimate aim. But Bioport still possessed the only military contract, and Fouad El-Hibri announced that he was primed to ramp up production. Practically every veteran federal bureaucrat was jockeying to ride the war on terror into the high-stakes winner's circle. The Military Medical Corps, maneuvering for its share of the overflowing stream of bioterrorism funding, had proposed that each American soldier should receive 75 new vaccines upon enlistment to cover every potential bioweapon. The brass asked President Bush to finance the development of this inoculation fusillade. Not to be outgunned by the military doctors, Dr. Fauci announced in an October 2002 speech that within 10 years, his institute would produce a vaccine, a therapeutic drug, and an adjuvant drug for each of some 24 bioweapons diseases, such as plague and hemorrhagic fever. According to an article in Scientific American, one scientist who requested anonymity said that Dr. Fauci told him that the Bush administration had demanded this goal and that he accepted it to prevent the Department of Defense or the Department of Homeland Security from getting the job. Dr. Fauci was openly competing with the military in an escalating campaign to soak the taxpayers, using the risk posed by anthrax as a pretext. NIAID's biodefense budget alone increased sixfold between 2002 and 2003, from $270 million to $1.75 billion. When no further bioterror attacks occurred over the next 10 years, Dr. Fauci skillfully maintained his annual $1.7 billion biosecurity funding by deftly recalibrating his rhetoric away from bioterrorism hype. Instead, he invoked the new panic of natural but emerging infectious diseases. Dr. Fauci's pivot to conflate infectious disease with terrorism proved a milestone inflection point in the militarization of pandemic response and in overcoming the traditional revulsion among Western democracies, codified in the Nuremberg Charter, against coercive medical interventions. Despite the fact that they had collectively killed only 800 people globally, the SARS coronavirus outbreaks between 2002 and 2004 were therefore a godsend to Dr. Fauci. The NIAID director ignored the most compelling caveat from those incidents, the fact that the coronavirus lab escapes in China, Taiwan, and Singapore had precipitated several of the outbreaks. Fauci boasted in 2011, through the anthrax response, we built both a physical and intellectual infrastructure that can be used to respond to a broad range of emerging health threats. By that time, the escalating intramural arms race to capture Pentagon, CIA, BARDA, DARPA, and HHS biosecurity funding was pulling the military, CIA, and NIAID deeper and deeper into the dicey alchemy of gain-of-function research that would ultimately culminate inside the BSL-4 Pandora's box in Wuhan. The CIA dips in its toe. The CIA had a long, sordid history of secretly promoting the U.S. bioweapons program. One of the agency's first projects was establishing a network of so-called rat lines that Army intelligence officers used to smuggle some 1,600 chemicals and bioweapons and MWD experts, many of them Nazi party kingpins and notorious war criminals, out of the reach of the Allies' Nuremberg prosecutors following World War II. The directors of a notorious operation codenamed Paperclip provided these researchers with new identities and put them to work developing U.S. germ warfare capacity at Fort Detrick and elsewhere, even after 1972. As late as 1997, the CIA defied the Bioweapons Treaty to launch a top-secret and highly illegal effort to create a doomsday bacteria bomblet. The CIA officially made its open debut in the biosecurity racket in 2004 with its launch of Argus, a project that monitors biological, terrorist, and pandemic threats in 178 nations. CIA operative and pediatrician Jim Wilson, keep the door open, Joe, set up the program at Georgetown University with funding from DHS and the Intelligence Innovation Center to create and implement global foreign biological event detection and tracking capability, capable of assessing millions of pieces of information about social behavior daily and to train government officials in pandemic preparedness. One of the key figures in this global surveillance effort was CIA officer Dr. Michael Callahan. Dr. Michael Callahan is one of the biggest names in bioweapons research. Dr. Callahan ran a biosecurity program for the former CIA surrogate USAID before serving as director of DARPA's bioweapons research program. At DARPA, he competed to outdo NIH in laundering money through Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance to perform bioweapons research, including at the Wuhan lab. And as DARPA director, Callahan launched the PREDICT project in 2009, following Jeremy Farrar's fake bird flu pandemic. PREDICT appeared to be a reincarnation of the CIA's Argus project under the cover of U.S. aid. PREDICT is the largest single source of funding to Daszak, with a $3.4 million subgrant routed through the University of California from 2015 to 2020. PREDICT became the largest funder of gain-of-function studies and served as the principal funding vehicle through which the gain-of-function cartel evaded Barack Obama's 2014 presidential moratorium. When, during the height of the presidential gain-of-function moratorium, Ralph Barrick and the UTMB's lab, Vineet UTMB Labs Vineet Meneshri brazenly published their alarming 2015 study describing their reckless experiments to breed pandemic bat coronaviruses that could spread via respiratory droplets in humanized mice, they omitted mentioning, in their initial online version of the article, that one of the funding sources was U.S. aid EPT PREDICT. Apparently, hoping to cover its tracks, PREDICT had laundered its grant money through Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance. U.S. aid's PREDICT program boasts that it has identified almost 1,000 new viruses, including a new strain of Ebola, and trained some 5,000 people. In October of 2019, not long before COVID-19 emerged, USAID abruptly ceased funding Project PREDICT, a decision bemoaned by Daszak in the New York Times as definitely a loss. Callahan had a chummy relationship with Daszak, with whom he co-authored several articles, including throughout the gain-of-function moratorium. In April of 2015, for example, the names of Michael V. Callahan and Peter Daszak appear as co-authors on a paper published in the Virology Journal entitled Diversity of Coronavirus in Bats from Eastern Thailand. Callahan was well aware that he and his Confederates were toying with fire. In 2005, Callahan testified before Congress as he was moving into his new office at DARPA. He concluded the hearing with a chilling warning about the nation's new commitment to Janus-based gain-of-function science that Drs. Fauci, Robert Callahan himself, and many others would proceed to blithely ignore. The dark science of biological weapon design and manufacture parallels that of the health sciences and the cross-mixed disciplines of modern technology. Potential advances in biological weapon lethality will in part be the byproduct of peaceful scientific progress. So until the time when there are no more terrorists, the U.S. government and the American people will depend on the scientific leaders of their field to identify any potential dark side aspect to every achievement. Even after leaving DARPA and U.S. aid, Callahan periodically boasted of his continuing influence over U.S. pandemic response policies at the highest level of government. He alluded to his confidence in these mysterious connections in 2012. I still have federal responsibilities to the White House for pandemic preparedness and exotic disease outbreak, which will continue for the near future. On January 4th of 2020, Callahan called Dr. Robert Malone from China just as the coronavirus began taking its first wave of casualties. Malone, a former contractor to the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases and the chief medical officer at Alchem Laboratories, is the inventor of the mRNA vaccine technology platform. Malone first met Callahan in 2009 through Malone's sometime business partner, Darrell Galloway, a CIA officer who formerly served in the U.S. Navy and at one point held the post of director of JSTO in the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. To Malone, Galloway introduced Callahan as a fellow CIA officer. During his January 4th phone call, Callahan told Malone that he was just outside Wuhan. Malone assumed that Callahan was visiting China under cover of his Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital appointments. Callahan told Malone that he had been treating hundreds of COVID patients. Callahan subsequently described to National Geographic how he had poured through thousands of case studies at the outbreak's epicenter. He giddily reported his amazement at the virus's magnificent infectivity and its capacity to explode like a silent smart bomb in your community. Callahan later confessed to Malone that he lacked authority to be in Wuhan and had escaped by boat when the government imposed its quarantine. Callahan repeated parts of his story to Brendan Borrell, a writer for Science. Later, Dieter scientist Davis Hone, a GS-15 officer, warned Malone to stop talking about Callahan, saying that we had no military personnel in Wuhan at the time of the outbreak and Michael was lying about his presence. Malone told me, well, that would mean that Michael also lied to Brendan Borrell. On leaving China, Callahan returned to Washington to brief federal officials and then went directly to work as a special advisor to Robert Kadlec, managing the government's response to the coronavirus. Robert Kadlec is Bad Santa, the El Hebrews cash-in. By 2011, Bioport was already profiting handsomely in the bioweapons vaccine space. After 9/11, President Bush, presumably at the urging of Secretary Rumsfeld, Robert Kadlec, and Dr. Fauci, whose advice he valued, had placed Bioport's Michigan lab under protection in the national interest. El Hebrew and his son, gnawing on Grizzle prior to 10-4, began fattening themselves on NIAID and BARDA contracts. With friends like Fauci and Kadlec in high places, Bioport, which changed its name to Emergent Biosolutions in 2004 to escape its checkered past, was enjoying the first bright days of the charmed journey that would place the El Hebrews among the elite army of COVID-19 nouveau billionaires in 2021. After 2001, Rumsfeld's Pentagon agreed to hike Bioport's compensation by 30% from $3.35 in its 1998 contract to $4.70 per dose, and to purchase anthrax shots for 2.4 million members of the armed forces, each of whom the military would require to receive 6 doses over an 18-month period. That was $600 million worth of poorly performing and unapproved vaccines for a threat that never again surfaced. The anthrax threat was always phantasmagoric. Since anthrax does not spread through human-to-human transmission, terrorists plotting an anthrax epidemic would need to somehow simultaneously release spores over dozens of U.S. cities. The anthrax deal was exceptionally ridiculous, since antibiotics are a far safer, more elegant, and more useful defense against anthrax. The prescribed remedy, ciprofloxacin, is a cheap, commonly used antibiotic that Tony Fauci himself recommended after the 2001 postal incidents. The best approach toward anthrax is antimicrobial therapy, Dr. Fauci admitted to Congress in 2007. Indeed, the night of the 9/11 attacks, the White House Medical Office thoughtfully and presciently dispensed ciprofloxacin to select White House staff who were accompanying Dick Cheney to the safety of Camp David. Furthermore, the El Hebre's anthrax jab was by far the worst of a bad lot. According to the Times, Emergent's anthrax vaccine was not the government's first choice. It was more than 30 years old and plagued by manufacturing challenges and complaints about side effects. Officials instead backed a company named VaxGen, which was developing a vaccine using newer technology licensed from the military. In 2004, the El Hebre's co-founded with their partner and former Joint Chiefs Chair, Admiral William Crowe, a lobbying group called the Alliance for Biosecurity as part of their strategy to secure lucrative BARDA-funded BioShield contracts and beat back upstart competitors like VaxGen. That lobbying group recruited two of Johns Hopkins Center for Biosecurity spooks with whom Cadlick had written the Dark Winter simulation, Tara O'Toole and Colonel Randall Larson, and enlisted more than 50 lobbyists to successfully block VaxGen from muscling in on its locked-up anthrax government monopoly. With these sorts of friends in high places, Emergent made the National Strategic Stockpile an exclusive captive market. By 2006, VaxGen had lost its $800 million contract and was bankrupt, and Emergent remained the government's sole source monopoly. Emergent then published VaxGen's anthrax vaccine for $2 million at pennies on the dollar. A 2021 New York Times expose titled How One Firm Put an Extraordinary Burden on the U.S.'s Troubled Stockpile documented Emergent's airtight domination of stockpile purchases. As Emergent prospered, other companies working on pandemic remedies for stockpile were squeezed out of government spending decisions. Several federal health officials anonymously told the Times that preparations for an outbreak like COVID-19 almost always took a backseat to Emergent's anthrax vaccines. By 2011, the El Hebre's connections had put Emergent in the driver's seat. Despite its vaccine's glaring and dangerous deficiencies, Emergent received $107 million in 2010 from Cadillac's baby BARDA, and up to $29 million from Fauci's NIAID to develop Nuthrax, its old anthrax vaccine with a new adjuvant, for large-scale manufacture in 2014. By 2010, Emergent's anthrax vaccine price had risen to about $28, now closer to $30 per dose, with 75% gross profit margin per the El Hebre's. As with Biothrax, the El Hebre's never performed functional safety testing for Nuthrax, and the FDA has never approved the vaccine, but BARDA recently contracted for $261 million worth of this experimental and notoriously dangerous unlicensed anthrax vaccine. By then, the company had grown from a single corporate office in Rockville, Maryland, to headquarters in Seattle, Munich, and Singapore. Its projects include developing vaccines for pandemic flu and tuberculosis in partnership with Oxford University and with funding from the Gates Foundation. Despite Nuthrax's failure to win an FDA approval, almost half of the Strategic National Stockpile's $500 million annual budget prior to 2020 went to Emergent's two anthrax vaccines. A cost that, according to the New York Times, left the government with less money to buy supplies needed in a pandemic. Some guardian angels with invisible hands seemed to catch the El Hebre's every time they stumbled. In March of 2021, two federal officials anonymously told the New York Times that one year the government increased in its order of Emergent's main anthrax vaccine by $100 million after the company insisted it needed the additional sales to stay in business. At the time that order was announced in 2016, the federal vaccine stockpile reserve already had enough to vaccinate more than 10 million people. The stockpile had long been the company's biggest and most reliable customer for its anthrax vaccines, which expire and need to be replaced every few years. After that, the cards really started breaking for the El Hebrews. When Cadleck left the federal government, the El Hebrews did not forget the man who rescued them from bankruptcy and possibly from arrest. In the summer of 2012, Fouad El Hebry made Robert Cadleck managing director and part owner of his own biodefense company, East-West Protection. The company received Pentagon backing that year to build a U.S. biodefense site in Utah in partnership with the HHS. CEO Bob Kramer told Forbes, "It was designed to prevent a future pandemic." With El Hebry financing, Cadleck founded a company, RPK Consulting, which provided consulting services to Emergent until 2015. The firm paid Cadleck $500,000 in 2014 alone. In 2015, the El Hebrews bought out Cadleck's shares of East West, allowing him to take the post of Deputy Staff Director for the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. 2 years later, President Donald Trump nominated Cadleck to become Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, ASPR, an office within Health and Human Services. During his confirmation process, Cadleck neglected to disclose his financial entanglements with the El Hebrews on the Senate nomination forms. The El Hebrews apparently anticipated a windfall for Emergent from Cadleck's new posting. In July of 2017, 4 days after Cadleck's nomination, Emergent announced that it was acquiring the rights to the smallpox vaccine from Sanofi Pasteur, the government's previous supplier. On August 3rd, the Senate confirmed Cadleck, and sure enough, although the U.S. taxpayers were now paying his salary, Cadleck never really stopped working for the El Hebrews. And that year, Christmas arrived early for the Lebanese arms dealers. Immediately after his appointment, Cadleck maneuvered deftly to move management of the Strategic National Stockpile, which he had conceived and created, from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to his own office, giving him authority over all acquisitions for the $7 billion contents. As soon as Emergent completed its acquisition of the Sanofi smallpox jab, Cadleck moved to increase the government's stockpile of these worthless and dangerous vaccines. Sanofi Pasteur had been charging the stockpile $4.27 per dose and had 5 years remaining on a 10-year government contract worth about $425 million. The El Hebrews initially sought only a modest price increase, but Cadleck generously finalized a sweetheart deal with his friends and former business partners, doubling the 5-year term that the El Hebrews had requested to 10. Cadleck also doubled the number of doses per year from 9 to 18 million and gave the El Hebrews twice the price per dose that Sanofi required. Cadleck's new contract for the El Hebrews promised Emergent $9.44 per dose in the first year, with that figure rising annually throughout the contract term. In the end, Cadleck awarded the El Hebrews a 10-year, $2.8 billion no-bid contract to purchase their smallpox vaccines. The stockpile was already overflowing with smallpox vaccines in 2018. The CDC reported on its website in June 2019 and continues to say that the stockpile already had sufficient smallpox vaccine for every American. Cadleck explained that his large purchase was necessary to keep the production base warm, another way of saying to keep the El Hebrews fat. Cadleck wrapped his gift with a red ribbon. Cadleck's brazenly corrupt announcement that the stockpile would no longer fund Emergent's competitors. Emergent Biosolutions received more than $1.2 billion in contracts from Cadleck during the Trump years, with millions more coming from NIAID and DARPA. Cadleck's brassy approach inspired awestruck admiration within the pharmaceutical industry. In March of 2020, Donald Trump's HHS Secretary Alex Azar, former Eli Lilly president and pharma lobbyist, designated Cadleck to lead the department's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Cadleck's appointment was a signal to Big Pharma of the impending orgy of ransack, pillage, and plunder. Naturally, the El Hebrews would enjoy the king's share of the booty. That same year, Cadleck invoked the emergency use authorization to purchase $370 million worth of the El Hebrews licensed and unlicensed anthrax vaccines. 2020 was the year with the largest sales of emergence anthrax vaccines to date. After the FDA authorized Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine for emergency use in February of 2021, Cadleck pressured the pharmaceutical giant to sign a $480 million contract with the El Hebrews to perform the manufacturing of J&J's COVID-19 jabs. Forbes headlined, "Little-known publicly traded company given massive deal to manufacture one-shot COVID-19 vaccine." By June, Cadleck's BARDA upped the ante with another $628 million gift to Emergent Biosolutions for scaling up production of targeted vaccine candidates. Emergent signed separate deals worth hundreds of millions with AstraZeneca and Bill Gates' Novavax to manufacture vaccine doses at its Gaithersburg, Maryland factory. A March 7th, 2021 New York Times expose about Emergent's crooked relationship with the government reported that $1 billion in payments to the company for anthrax and smallpox vaccines took up almost half the Strategic National Stockpile's budget. Emergent had become the #1 vendor to the stockpile. To finance these windfalls for the El Hebrews, Cadleck needed to short other stockpile supplies. By the time the novel coronavirus emerged, the stockpile had only 12 million N95 respirators. Cadleck also scuttled an Obama-era initiative to spend a relatively trivial $35 million to build a machine that could produce $1.5 million N95 masks per day. To rationalize their inventory gaps, Cadleck pled poverty. The New York Times reported shocking shortfalls in protective gear for healthcare workers, ventilators, and masks, just as the COVID-19 crisis called for them. Well aware of the situation, Cadleck was unwilling to free up money by reducing the supply of anthrax vaccines. The El Hebrews' second sugar daddy, Dr. Anthony Fauci, was also raining down mana on Emergent. At the beginning of the pandemic, Emergent signed a development deal with NIAID for a plasma-derived therapy. Dr. Fauci aimed to incorporate the company's COVID-HIG product into one of NIAID's clinical studies, with initial funding of $14.5 million coming from Cadleck through BARDA. In turn, Cadleck supported Dr. Fauci's pet project, Moderna, the mRNA jab caper that Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates considered their holy grail. In mid-April of 2020, Cadleck arranged for BARDA to provide Moderna up to $480 million to accelerate the Fauci-Gates vaccines development and manufacturing. That amounted to about half of what BARDA doled out to all of Moderna's competitors combined, including Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca. Cadleck was also generous to Bill Gates, arranging a $1.6 billion grant, the largest to date, from Operation Warp Speed to Gates' biotech selection, Novavax. Although the company, based in Gaithersburg, Maryland, had never brought a vaccine to market in its 33-year history and was then on the verge of collapse, Gates and his obedient minions at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, or CEPI, had placed a bet on Novavax's technology, which uses moth cells to pump out crucial molecules at a faster rate than typical vaccines. Cadleck's generosity with his warp speed wampum caused Novavax's stock to surge 30%. John J. Trezino, Novavax's chief business and financial officer, said the company did nothing inappropriate, but acknowledged that it used its connections to Gates to help win the deals. In September of 2019, less than a month before COVID began circulating, the Gates Foundation made a $55 million pre-IPO equity investment in Bioweapons. The company also had never brought a single product to market. Soon afterwards, the German government followed Gates with $445 million infusion into Bioweapons. On July 21, 2020, when Robert Cadleck committed Operation Warp Speed to a $2 billion purchase of 100 million doses of BioNTech Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine, the company's stock value soared, with Bill Gates' equity shares increasing to an evaluation of $1.1 billion. In October of 2020, Emergent became one of 4 companies collaborating on a clinical trial for a combination treatment regimen That included Dr. Fauci's drug remdesivir as a background therapy. The company said in a statement, Emergent is proud to continue our partnership with NIAID and NIH and BARDA to advance potential therapeutic solutions for COVID-19 in hospitalized patients. Bill Gates owned a large stake in remdesivir's manufacturer Gilead, whose own studies show clearly, even WHO acknowledged, that remdesivir was useless against COVID. Worse, the drug's extreme toxicity, remdesivir's effects mimic the late-stage symptoms of COVID, may actually aggravate the severity of the illness. To overcome these obstacles, Dr. Fauci financed and rigged a suite of flawed studies to suggest, deceptively, that remdesivir might slightly reduce the number of days a patient would stay in the hospital. The WHO's much larger studies proved that there was no reduction in the length of hospital stay. Nevertheless, using his blatantly orchestrated research, Dr. Fauci then forced remdesivir's approval through FDA as standard of care for COVID. At the same time, Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates were financing and promoting studies to discredit chloroquine and hydrochloroquine and sabotage ivermectin, two effective COVID remedies that posed an existential threat to the remdesivir and entire Fauci-Gates COVID vaccine enterprises. Emergent's CEO, Robert Kramer, boasted to Wall Street analysts in February of 2021 that the year had been the strongest year in our 22-year history. The New York Times reported that Emergent's stock had reached such a zenith that Fouad El-Hibri cashed in shares and options worth over $42 million, more than he had redeemed in the previous 5 years combined. When in April of 2021, Emergent Biosolutions ruined 15 million Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccines due to quality control mishaps at its poorly managed Baltimore production facility, Congress launched an investigation into whether Emergent used high-level connections to get billions of dollars in federal contracts despite a history of failing to deliver satisfactorily on its contracts. Congressional investigators also raised concerns about Emergent's inadequate staff training, persistent quality control issues, and the company's stifling the government with an unjustified 800% price increase for its anthrax vaccine. Stiffing the government with an unjustified 800% price increase for its anthrax vaccine. The Democratic chairs of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and Select Oversight Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis focused their inquiry on Cadlec's role. In a letter, the committee chairs complained that Cadlec appears to have pushed for the $628 million award to Emergent to develop a COVID vaccine factory, despite indications that Emergent did not have the ability to reliably fulfill the contract. As the top dog among the COVID-19 pandemic's government managers, Cadlec had promoted Emergent as the United States' primary vaccine manufacturing facility. In April of 2021, the Times published another extensive expose reporting that Emergent had not yet been able to produce a single acceptable dose of any COVID-19 vaccine. Following exposés in the New York Times and the Washington Post, J&J took over production at that plant. The FDA stepped in after inspecting the facility and ordered Emergent to halt all production of materials for COVID-19 vaccines, pending review and remediation, and to quarantine all other existing materials. HHS ordered Emergent to discard millions of contaminated doses. Instead, in March of 2021, the company shipped millions of doses of its defective vaccines to Canada, Europe, South Africa, and Mexico. The House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis held hearings on May 19th of 2021 and ordered Emergent to turn over all its federal contracts since 2015 and all communications with Robert Cadlec. Emergent's political invincibility left the company unbowed by all those scandals. In July of 2020, Emergent announced a 5-year, $450 million deal to manufacture COVID drugs for Johnson & Johnson. In February of 2021, HHS awarded Emergent another contract, this one worth up to $22 million, to develop a COVID-19 therapy. Atlantic Storm, 2003-2005. In January of 2003 and again in 2005, a cabal of U.S. and European military intelligence and medical officials germ-gamed another exercise they called Atlantic Storm. Thomas V. Inglesby and the spooks Tara O'Toole and Colonel Randall J. Larson were the simulation's principal authors. Both the 1999 HHS smallpox simulation and the June 2001 Dark Winter smallpox simulation focused ominously not on public health but on the quandary of how to impose control over U.S. and global populations during public health emergencies, how to sweep away civil rights and impose mass obedience to military and medical technocrats. Atlantic Storm further probed these sinister disquisitions. High-level government figures, including Madeleine Albright playing the President of the United States and WHO Director General Gro Harlem Brundtland playing herself, hosted a summit of transatlantic military and intelligence agency planners coordinating responses after a radical terrorist band unleashes smallpox. According to the after-action report, the key issues for summit principals were coping with scarcity of critical medical resources such as vaccines and assuring a uniform, coordinated response among all governments in the world. The simulation stressed the inadequacy of current multilateral frameworks like NATO and the EU to cope with social, economic, and political disruption from an international epidemic, be it natural or the result of a bioterrorist attack, and emphasized the importance of developing systems to coordinate global lockstep security protocols that went beyond just stockpiling vaccines or training more doctors. Characteristically, the assembled MCs bypassed any characteristically assembled eminences bypassed any discussion of bolstering people's immune system response testing or distributing off-label therapeutics, went directly to recommending militarized strategies, including police state controls, mass propaganda, censorship, and the suspension of civil rights and due process rulemaking in favor of diktats by health authorities, all aimed at coercive vaccination of the population. These scenarios, which health officials and spooks conceived of and gamed back in 2005, became our collective reality in 2020 and 2021. Global Mercury 2003. Between September 8th and 10th of that same year, the spooks at the U.S. State Department Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism organized another scenario exercise dubbed Global Mercury, with the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, the WHO, and the Department of State. Over a 56-hour period, public health technocrats coordinated communications and lockstep response between trusted agents from GHSAG, GSAG nations, the United States, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Mexico, during a simulated outbreak after self-inoculated terrorists spread smallpox to countries around the world. The SCL Simulation 2005. Atlantic Storm and Global Mercury were additional loud notes amplifying persistent Pentagon signals that biosecurity was the emerging growth sector for national defense. In response to such toxins, private military contractors began thronging to the pandemic surveillance and PSYOP sector like hogs to a corn crib. Long before Robert Mercer with his daughter Rebecca became Donald Trump's biggest private donors, and before they launched the right-wing social media platform Parler, he created the first private sector provider of psychological warfare services in 1993. The Mercer's Strategic Communications Laboratories, or SCL Group, was the parent company to the notorious data manipulating firm Cambridge Analytica. This brand new PSYOPs firm, headquartered in the UK, drew some of the largest crowds in 2005 when it set up a high-tech propaganda ops center at the UK's annual Military Technology Showcase. As a contemporary article in Slate described the SCL simulation, classic signs of smallpox are threatening a pandemic of epic proportions when a shadowy media firm steps in to help orchestrate a sophisticated campaign of mass deception. SCL takes on the task of convincing the entire country's population to comply with lockdown rules by inventing a lie about an unleashed cloud of toxic chemicals. The mission's objective is to prevent mass panic and casualties from the classified threat of smallpox. SCL feeds disinformation to the press and manufactures medical data. Londoners stay indoors, convinced that even a short walk into the streets could be fatal. The article continues, if FCL weren't so earnest, it might actually seem to be mocking itself, or perhaps George Orwell. At the end of the smallpox scenario, dramatic music fades out into a taped message urging buyers to embrace strategic communications, which it describes as the most powerful weapon in the world. What makes SCL's strategy so unusual is that it proposes to propagate its campaign domestically, at least some of the time, and rather than influence just opinion, it wants people to take a particular course of action. The company based its PSYOP strategies on propaganda techniques developed by a virtual lab called the Behavioral Dynamics Institute, run out of Leeds University by Professor Phil Taylor, a consultant to UK and American defense agencies until his death at 56 in 2010. The article identified SCL only as funded by private investors. Company chief Nigel Oakes described its nefarious skullduggery as mind-bending for political purposes. In March 20th, 2018 interview with Yahoo Finance, Oakes described himself as a man without much of an ethical radar. According to SCL's public affairs director, Mark Brofton, basically we're launching ourselves on the defense market and homeland security market at the same time. Aware that the company might face criticism over its promotion of totalitarian security states, Brofton emphasized to slate the company's role in saving lives. There's some altruism in it, he said grudgingly, but we also want to earn money. How war games became instruments for imposing obedience. Dark Winter, Atlantic Storm, and Global Mercury were only 3 of over a dozen Germ games staged by military, medical, and intelligence planners leading up to COVID-19. Each of these Kafkaesque exercises became uncanny predictors of a dystopian age that pandemic planners dubbed the new normal. The consistent features and affinity among their simulation designers for militarizing medicine and introducing centralized autocratic governance. Each rehearsal ends with the same grim punchline. The global pandemic is an excuse to justify the imposition of tyranny and coerced vaccination. The repetition of these exercises suggests that they serve as a kind of rehearsal or training drill for an underlying agenda to coordinate the global dismantlement of democratic governments. Military intelligence analysts first introduced scenario planning as a strategic device during World War II. RAND's iconic military planner, Herman Kahn, used sophisticated wargame simulations to model nuclear engagement strategies in the Cold War era. Working for Royal Dutch Shell, futurologists Pierre Wack and Peter Schwartz of the Global Business Network, or GBN, pioneered scenario planning simulations as a strategic device for their corporate clients in the 1970s and 80s. By the millennium, simulations had evolved into an indispensable vehicle for military policymakers, intelligence agency planners, public health technocrats, and the petroleum and pharmaceutical multinationals for reinforcing prescribed responses that allowed predictable and rigid control of the outcomes of future crises. After 9/11, the rising biosecurity cartel adopted simulations as signaling mechanisms for choreographing lockstep response among corporate, political, and military technocrats charged with managing global exigencies. Scenario planning became an indispensable device for multiple power centers to coordinate complex strategies for simultaneously imposing coercive controls upon democratic societies around the globe. Virtually all of the scenario planning for pandemics employed technical assumptions and strategies familiar to anyone who has read the CIA's notorious psychological warfare manuals for shattering indigenous societies, obliterating traditional economics and social bonds, for using imposed isolation and the demolition of traditional economies to crush resistance, to foster chaos, demoralization, dependence, and fear, and for imposing centralized and autocratic governance. In particular, the exercises incorporate PSYOP techniques gleaned from the notorious Milgram obedience experiments. In those 1960s exercises, Yale social psychology professor Dr. Stanley Milgram was able to show that researchers could formulaically manipulate ordinary citizens from all walks of life to violate their own conscience and commit atrocities, so long as an authority figure, a doctor in a white lab coat, for example, ordered them to do it. The subjects believed they were torturing fellow volunteers by electrocution, out of sight in an adjacent room. As a doctor instructed them to rev up the juice, the recruits could hear the nightmarish screaming of actors pretending to be suffering electrocution and their pleadings for mercy. Of Milgram's 40 subjects, some 65% administered the full-bore 450-volt shocks they had been told were potentially fatal. Milgram described his experiments as proof that obedience to authority trumps morality and conscience. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and, with subjects' ears ringing with screams of victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study. In his book, A Question of Torture, CIA Interrogation from the Cold War to the War on Terror, University of Wisconsin historian Alfred W. McCoy suggests that the Yale obedience experiments were funded by the CIA as part of the MK Ultra studies on the control of human behavior. During that time, the CIA funneled money through various federal agencies to fund 185 independent researchers to perform sinister behavioral manipulation studies in universities across North America. Milgram first proposed his obedience research in a 1960 solicitation to the group psychology branch of the Office of Naval Research, or ONR, a key conduit for the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control experiments. The dean who hired Milgram later as a professor at City University of New York was a former deputy director of ONR. Milgram's Yale mentor was Irving J. L. Janis, who wrote the seminal Air Force study of Soviet mind control and hypnosis for the Rand Corporation. Milgram's other connections to the CIA's psychological warfare program are too numerous to mention here. In an equally important revelation, the CIA mind-controlled experiments identified social isolation as the primary protocol for controlling societal and individual behavior. In 1960, one of the agency's most active contractors, Lawrence Hinkle of Cornell, confirmed the significance of social isolation. For the CIA mind-controlled effort, in light of the neurological literature, the most promising of all known techniques. The CIA's research found that the effect of isolation on the brain function and on an individual is much like that which occurs if he is beaten, starved, or deprived of sleep. Social isolation affects organic brain development and the human body, length of life, cardiovascular health, and so on. Social isolation doubles the risk of death in blacks while increasing the risk of early death in Caucasians by 60 to 84%, while other studies show that it is safer to smoke 15 cigarettes a day to be an alcoholic than it is to be socially isolated. Meta-analysis co-authored by Julianne Holt Lundstad, Ph.D., a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University, found that lack of social connection heightens health risks as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day or having alcohol use disorder. Holt Lundstad also found that social isolation is twice as harmful to physical and mental health as obesity. There is robust evidence that social isolation significantly increases the risk for premature mortality, and that the magnitude of the risk exceeds that of many leading health indicators. NIH's collaboration with the CIA in these odious torture, obedience, and brainwashing experiments heaps additional ignominy on the agency. During the 1950s, NIH scientist Dr. Maitland Baldwin conducted social isolation experiments on monkeys and humans at NIH headquarters and CIA safe houses. MK Ultra's experiments used expendables, people whose deaths or disappearances would go unnoticed, including a rather gruesome experiment in which Baldwin had subjected a soldier to 40 hours of isolation, causing him to go insane, to kick apart the box in which Maitland had imprisoned him. Maitland, who told his Operation Artichoke case officer that isolating subjects for over 40 hours could cause irreparable damage and perhaps be terminal, nevertheless agreed to go forward if the agency could provide cover and subjects. The various scenario planning simulations provided a unique forum to convene key decision makers and to introduce and then to sanction, with authoritative voices, previously unspeakable conduct that violated democratic and ethical norms. That conduct included the forced isolation and quarantine of entire populations, including the healthy, censoring free speech, violating privacy with track and trace surveillance systems, trampling property rights and religious freedoms, and obliterating traditional economies via nationwide business lockdowns, enforced masking, coercive medical interventions, and other assaults on human rights, civil rights, constitutions, and democracies. With each new simulation, the staccato repetition of the message by trusted experts, doctors in lab coats, and authoritative collectives like Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Senator Sam Nunn, WHO Director General Gro Harlem Brundtland, and Senator Tom Daschle, reinforced the lesson that censorship, isolation, the militarization of medicine, totalitarian controls, and coercive vaccine mandates are the only appropriate response to pandemics. Scenario planning, in other words, is a potent brainwashing technique for creating and fortifying anti-democratic orthodoxies among key political leaders, the press, and the technocracy, and preparing the nation to tolerate a coup d'etat against its constitution without resistance.